War has a way of revealing people who refuse to follow the rule book. In Vietnam, the battlefield was filled with helicopters, artillery, and carefully planned tactics written by generals far from the jungle. But sometimes the men flying those missions decided the rules simply didn't apply. One of those men was First Lieutenant Allan Cozzalio, a helicopter pilot who treated the war like a cavalry charge from another century. While others fought from a safe distance, he believed the fastest way to solve a problem was to fly straight at it. His helicopter would be shot down again and again. His commanders would shake their heads. And yet every time, he climbed back into the cockpit. Because in the Mekong Delta, survival often belonged to the pilot willing to do the one thing no one else dared. Trapped Patrol. January 25, 1969. Near Phu Village, deep in the Mekong Delta, soldiers from Charlie Company, 5th Battalion, 60th Infantry, were moving across an open rice paddy when a hidden North Vietnamese position erupted with machine gun fire. The flat field offered almost no cover, only muddy water and shattered stalks of rice. The company commander was among the first to fall. Several other soldiers went down in the opening burst. The rest dropped to the mud, desperately looking for cover that simply wasn't there. They were pinned. For nearly 2 hours, the men remained trapped in that open ground. Every attempt to move brought another burst from the bunker. Anyone who tried to crawl even a short distance risked being cut down. Support arrived quickly, but couldn't solve the problem. Cobra gunships circled overhead. But the Americans were lying barely 50 meters from the enemy position. Any air attack at that range risked killing the very men they were there to save. Artillery couldn't reach the bunker either. It had been built deep and reinforced against bombardment. Attempts to maneuver resulted only in more wounded. Time was running out. Ammunition was nearly gone. Wounded soldiers lay bleeding in the dirt. And the machine gun kept hammering. Then something appeared in the sky above the rice paddy. A small helicopter, dropping lower than it had any business being. And in the cockpit, a white Stetson cavalry hat. The impossible landing. The pilot wearing that hat was First Lieutenant Allan Cozzalio. Instead of pulling away from the gunfire, he pushed the helicopter lower. Much lower. The small OH-6 Loach scout helicopter dropped to barely 10 feet above the enemy position. The rotor wash blasted dust and debris from the sandbags as it hovered almost directly above the machine gun nest. Bullets slammed through the thin plexiglass canopy. Cozzalio didn't climb away. He didn't fire from a safe distance. He landed on top of the bunker. His crew chief leapt from the helicopter, sprinted to the firing port, and dropped a grenade inside. Then he scrambled back aboard. Cozzalio yanked the collective. The helicopter lifted, just as the bunker exploded beneath them. The machine gun fell silent. And in that muddy rice field below, the men of Charlie Company survived because a helicopter pilot from the Oregon-California border decided the standard rules of war were useless. Sometimes, he believed, the solution wasn't complicated. Sometimes you simply land on the problem. A different kind of pilot. That moment captured exactly who Allan Cozzalio was. He was the pilot who walked out of a military hospital to return to combat. The man who captured enemy soldiers using a Civil War cavalry saber. The flyer shot down repeatedly during a single tour, and who kept climbing back into the cockpit every time. To the men in his unit, he wasn't just another helicopter pilot. He was the cowboy who turned a tiny scout helicopter into a weapon of chaos. And the strange thing was, Cozzalio had never planned to become a pilot at all. From ranch to war, Allan Cozzalio grew up along the rugged border country between California and Oregon, on a cattle ranch where independence wasn't a philosophy, it was simply how things were done. Problems were handled personally, not passed to someone else. When his draft notice arrived in 1966, he didn't resist. He attended officer candidate school, earned his commission, and then volunteered for helicopter flight training. Flying came naturally to him, not because he was a prodigy, but because helicopters reminded him in some way of horses. You didn't fight them, you worked with them. You listened to the machine and felt how it wanted to move. He graduated flight school in 1967. Within months, he was on a transport plane heading straight into the war, the bastard cavalry. He arrived at Dong Tam Base Camp, assigned to Delta Troop, 3rd Squadron, 5th Cavalry Regiment, operating with the 9th Infantry Division in the Mekong Delta. The unit carried an unusual nickname, the Bastard Cavalry. Unlike traditional cavalry units, they weren't attached to a cavalry division. They operated independently, orphans in the military structure. The name suited them. The troop kept alive the traditions of the old horse cavalry. Pilots wore yellow scarves and white Stetson hats, small nods to the riders who had once charged across open ground with sabers drawn. Most pilots treated it as a bit of tradition. Cozzalio took it far more seriously. By the accounts of men who served alongside him, he sometimes appeared wearing cavalry-style dress, a blue coat, a yellow silk scarf, the white Stetson, and hanging from his belt, a genuine Civil War cavalry saber. It wasn't decoration, he intended to use it. The helicopter horseman. While many helicopter pilots thought of themselves as modern aviators, Cozzalio believed he was continuing something much older. The cavalrymen of the past hadn't fought from a distance. They had ridden straight toward the enemy with speed and aggression. To Cozzalio, the helicopter was simply a faster horse. If the mission required flying closer than doctrine recommended, closer than seemed reasonable, then that's exactly what he would do. His call sign was War Wagon 10, and what he did in the tiny OH-6 Loach wasn't reconnaissance. It was combat. Flying the Loach, the Hughes OH-6 Cayuse, nicknamed the Loach, was a small helicopter with a bubble canopy that made it look like a flying fishbowl, designed for observation. The standard guidance was straightforward. Stay high, stay safe, locate the enemy, call in the gunships. Cozzalio ignored most of that guidance. He flew the aircraft at treetop level, sometimes even lower. He skimmed over rice paddies so close to the surface that the rotor wash pushed the water aside, sometimes revealing hidden bunkers or tunnel entrances beneath. He hovered beside narrow canals close enough for his door gunner to peer directly into enemy positions. To Cozzalio, according to those who flew with him, this wasn't recklessness. It was tactical logic. At altitude, the Loach was a slow, fragile target. Down low, it was agile, capable of turning faster than most enemy gunners could track. The strategy was to get close enough that the enemy reacted, force them to fire, reveal their position. Then the Cobra gunships circling above would do the rest. This tactic had been developed and practiced across the Delta under the name Pink Team Operations. The scout helicopter, designated the White Team, flew low to draw fire. The gunships, the Red Team, circled above waiting to attack anything that revealed itself. White plus Red. Pink Team. It worked, but it came with a heavy price. The first crash. Cozzalio learned that price quickly. After only a handful of combat flying hours, his helicopter was shot down. The crash left him with a broken jaw and other injuries. He was evacuated to a military hospital in Japan for surgery and recovery. Normally, that ended a pilot's Vietnam tour. Recover, then return to the United States. War over. Cozzalio had other plans. With his jaw still wired shut, he located a transport flight heading back to Vietnam and boarded it. Technically, he had left the hospital without authorization, a serious breach of military regulations. He didn't care. His unit was still fighting. Back to the war. When Cozzalio turned up back at Dong Tam, jaw still wired, calmly reporting for duty, his commanders had a choice. In a war where skilled helicopter pilots willing to fly the missions nobody else wanted were scarce, a man who had escaped a hospital just to return to the fight was not someone they were going to send back. They put him in the cockpit. Over the following months, he would be shot down again and again, 6 times in total, over the course of his tour, by the accounts of men who served with him. And every time he survived. Among the crews, something harder to define than respect began to grow around him. Not because he never got hit, but because he never stayed down. The cavalry spirit. Another Vietnam scout pilot, Lieutenant Colonel Hugh L. Mills Jr., knew Cozzalio personally. Mills himself had been shot down multiple times during the war and understood better than most what flying the Loach truly cost. Years later, Mills recalled his fellow pilot with a directness that said more than any formal tribute could. Ace was the eternal cavalryman, he said, by his own later account. He lived and breathed the cavalry tradition. It wasn't unusual to see him walking around the troop area in a full 19th century uniform with the old saber on his belt. Some people thought he was eccentric. I thought he was the real thing. Both men shared something unusual. Both had left hospitals to return to combat. Both captured enemy prisoners directly from helicopters. Both flew the Loach as if the aircraft were an extension of their own instincts. And both understood one brutal truth about operating in the Mekong Delta. The safe way to fly could get you killed just as easily as the reckless way. The difference was, sometimes the reckless way won the fight. The canal capture. In September 1968, Cozzalio spotted a Viet Cong soldier diving into a canal to hide. Standard procedure was to mark the location and move on. Cozzalio landed. He stepped out of the helicopter wearing his white Stetson, drew the Civil War saber, and waded into the water. Using the blade, he probed the murky bottom. Then he felt something solid. A man burst from the water, gasping for air. A fighter who had been lying submerged, breathing through a reed, waiting for the helicopter to leave. Cozzalio marched him back to the aircraft at sword point. The prisoner stood on the landing skid as Cozzalio flew him back to base for interrogation. There is reportedly a photograph. By later accounts, when someone asked why he went to such lengths to capture prisoners rather than simply recording their position, Cozzalio offered a straightforward answer. Scout crews received beer and soda credits for delivering prisoners. He suggested they got reasonably good at it. It wasn't the only time. Stories began spreading across the Delta about the strange American pilot in a white cowboy hat who landed his helicopter and dragged enemy fighters out of canals with a cavalry sword. The legend grew. But those captures were only a sideshow, because the moment that would truly define Allan Cozzalio's war was still coming. The Trap, January 25, 1969. The rice paddy near Phu village in the Mekong Delta offered nowhere to hide and no way forward. Charlie Company had walked into the kill zone of a well-prepared North Vietnamese bunker. The company commander was killed in the opening moments. More men fell before the unit could react. The survivors went flat in the mud and stayed there. For 2 hours they didn't move. Every attempt to advance brought fire. Every call for support ran into the same problem. The Americans were too close to the bunker for safe air or artillery attack. Cobra gunships circled overhead, unable to engage without risking the men on the ground. Artillery plotted against the position, but couldn't guarantee accuracy at that range. Every option available had the same fatal flaw. The bunker had been dug deep and reinforced. It had survived everything thrown at it. Ammunition was nearly gone. Wounded men lay bleeding in the dirt, and the machine gun kept firing. The calculation. Allan Cozzalio arrived overhead in a Cobra gunship and began circling slowly, studying the problem. What he saw, according to accounts of the engagement, was something others may have overlooked. The bunker's firing port faced outward across the rice paddy. The machine gun inside was designed to engage targets in front of it. Across the flat ground, it could not elevate enough to engage something directly above. The bunker was deadly from the front. It was vulnerable from the top. Cozzalio made a decision that surprised everyone watching. He landed the Cobra nearby, walked over to a small OH-6 Loach from the reconnaissance section standing nearby, and climbed in. Moments later, the little helicopter lifted off and turned back toward the battlefield. The descent. The trapped soldiers in the rice paddy watched the Loach appear overhead. Then it began dropping, lower, lower still, down to 10 feet above the bunker. Enemy fire immediately reached upward, rounds punching through the plexiglass canopy and tearing through the thin aluminum skin of the aircraft. Men on the ground watched the helicopter keep descending toward the machine gun that had been killing them for 2 hours. One survivor later described the sight as something almost impossible to process. A small aircraft coming straight down into the fire that had stopped an entire infantry company. The rotor wash blasted dust and debris from the sandbags. Tracer rounds streaked past the cockpit. The sounds inside the helicopter, as rounds struck the airframe, must have been tremendous. Then the skids touched down. Cozzalio had landed directly on top of the bunker, ending the fire. The moment the helicopter settled, the crew chief jumped out onto the sandbags above the bunker. He pulled a fragmentation grenade from his vest, pulled the pin, dropped it through the firing port, and scrambled back into the aircraft. Cozzalio pulled the collective. The Loach lifted into the air, just as the bunker erupted beneath them. The blast shook the helicopter violently. Smoke and debris erupted upward from the shattered fortification. Then the battlefield fell silent. The machine gun that had pinned down Charlie Company for 2 hours was gone. For a moment, the men lying in the rice paddy barely moved, as if they needed a few seconds to believe what they had just witnessed. Then they realized something extraordinary. They were alive. Aftermath. Cozzalio wasn't finished. He landed beside the infantry, stepped out of the helicopter, and quickly briefed the ground commander on the positions of other enemy forces he had observed from above, along with the best direction for an assault. Then he returned to the air and switched back to his Cobra gunship, providing cover as the soldiers advanced and secured the area. A general officer who had been watching the entire engagement from a command helicopter above landed shortly after. According to the official record, he promoted Cozzalio on the spot, awarded him the Silver Star, and recommended him for the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest decoration for valor in the United States military. Cozzalio received the DSC officially on May 7, 1969. A soldier's legacy. The soldiers who survived that day did not forget. More than 50 years later, surviving members of Charlie Company wrote to the United States Senate asking that Cozzalio's Distinguished Service Cross be upgraded to the Medal of Honor. In their letter, they stated it plainly that they owed their lives to him, that he had attacked a fortified position in a scout helicopter when every other option had been exhausted, and that without what he did that afternoon, none of them would have made it home. Cozzalio went on to accumulate more than 2,000 combat flying hours in Vietnam and was shot down 6 times over the course of his tour. His decorations included the Distinguished Service Cross, the Silver Star, multiple Distinguished Flying Crosses, 2 Purple Hearts, and dozens of air medals. He later reached the rank of Lieutenant Colonel and contributed to the development of helicopter combat tactics that continued to influence Army aviation long after the war ended. He died in 1993 at the age of 46, following complications from heart disease. But among helicopter pilots, and among the soldiers who served in the Delta, his story never entirely disappeared, because sometimes the difference between defeat and survival comes down to one person who simply refuses to accept that something cannot be done. And on that afternoon near Phu Village, Ace Cozzalio proved that sometimes the best way to solve a problem is to land on it.